Hello, everybody. My name is James McCool. I'm going to be joined by Mr. Pablo Knows Best here. This is the Paydirt Slate Talk, part of the Theory Crafting podcast series. We record this in the Discord. It is free to listen to, but if you're catching up on YouTube, then welcome. Let's get ready for the NFL DFS Slate. We will take questions from the Discord at the end of this, but for the most part, it's going to be me and Pablo going back and forth. I'm talking through a little bit more of the game theory and nitty-gritty stuff, not so much the high-level stuff. We talked about a lot of the high-level stuff in the Bakery, which comes out on Friday night. That is a Paydirt paywalled podcast, which is a visual podcast as well. So if you want more of the high-level stuff and like the basic stuff, go listen to that one. This one is going to be more game theory oriented. We'll still talk about some of the lower-level stuff, but mostly game theory stuff. So thank you for joining us. Pablo, how you doing?
I'm good. I like this slate. I think it's got the ability to be creative in terms of lineup construction, in terms of plays in popular games that you can sort of play in different ways. And I think slates that offer a little more flexibility generally are good for folks who are better at building higher upside lineups with good leverage. So I actually like this slate a lot more than I've liked the last few, and I'm hoping that translates into better results. Been a not great start, but I feel like this is around the time we usually start to cook.
Yeah, I agree. For the most part, like I have liked the last two slates where I was able to just say, all right, there's really good chalk at running back. There's really good chalk that I can eat as secondary correlations at wide receiver. And then I can just get a little bit different with my stack, right? Like that's kind of been the last 2 weeks where I was on Minnesota both weeks. I think I played a San Francisco stack both weeks. Yeah, I did because Jordan Mason was 60%. Oh, wait, no, I didn't. Week 2, I played 100% Jordan Mason and 100% Zach Charbonnet, and that's what I should have done last week as well, but I didn't. And I have found mostly that what I'm doing is kind of just leveraging the running back chalk with a stack and trying to find my leverage that way because the chalk has been really good, or at least it has projected really well and been in a really good spot the last 2 weeks. This week is different, where this week I kind of just want to eat the chalk stacks and be different with my running backs and my wide receivers. And I think you feel the same way?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think running back particularly feels very wide open this week to me. And while I do think we'll see a few guys get steamed up more than we even have already this week, I think we'll get even tonight and tomorrow morning, folks like Najee Harris will get a little higher. I feel like there's a lot more pivots available across a wide price range. And so I feel very similarly. I don't, especially as a small field player that's typically correlating a lot more than larger field players. I feel like I don't need to get that wild with my primary stacks because I am so comfortable getting a little different at wide receiver and running back. And that's, to me, that's fun because but I just feel like that offers more options and it's more about, it allows you to decide who do you feel more conviction about as opposed to just purely playing the ownership game.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And looking at the ownerships for running backs, when I sort by ownership, it's not like these guys are bad plays. If I just sort by medians over in the sheets, which by the way, if you don't have a Paydirt subscription and you are here listening in the Discord, you should go grab a subscription, even if it's just a day pass, so you can have a little bit better context of what we're talking about. But when I sort by median in the running back range of outcomes, like, first off, there's not that much chalk in the high medians. Saquon Barkley only projects for about 11% ownership. I think that goes up. I'm not sure. Theoretically, people should assume that he is going to get a higher workload with no A.J. Brown and no Devontae Smith, so I think that probably ends up somewhere in the 15-20% range. But I'm not entirely sure. That would mean that Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson both have to drop relatively significantly, and I don't think that will happen. Jordan Mason projects well still. DraftKings has not priced him up enough, so he still projects well. 22% ownership. He's the main chalk this week, and I'm not sure that he will continue to be the main chalk. We've seen, like, if you go over and you look in the research sheets and you look at the ownership trends, we can see that the bigger trend right now is on Brian Robinson Jr. So on Thursday he projected for 13% ownership. Friday dropped down to 12.81, but then today he jumped up to about 18%. So he's got the third highest trending ownership at the moment. So I think he's probably going to end up being like at least 20 to 25% owned and be one of the higher chalky pieces. But all this to say that the mediums, they're really not that heavy in terms of chalk. And then when you drop down even a little bit farther, you have guys like Jerome Ford, who projects well at 5% ownership. Jonathan Taylor, 7,700 for Jonathan Taylor. He is less than 1% owned, and he's been good. That's way too low. Travis Etienne Jr. at 7K, he's 1% owned. Rashad White, who just got a questionable tag, 2% owned, but if he plays in a good spot. Bucky Irving right behind him at 5,300. He would get a lot of ownership if Rashad White is ruled out and probably end up being 20% owned as well. But you're right. There's a really wide range of running backs that I think are all playable. And we have seen, I've been saying for a couple weeks now, running backs who are getting opportunity, you can just kind of slate them in for 18 to 22 fantasy points. Like, there's a lot of guys who are getting somewhere between 20 and 25 opportunities a game, and they're just not priced up high enough. Aaron Jones is one of those guys. He projects for 11% ownership. I think he should be way higher. He's 6,400, and he's getting 20 to 25 opportunities a game. Zach Moss is another guy who looks really good in this spot. Josh Jacobs is getting massive workloads. Like, Chuba Hubbard got fed last week. He projects for 16% ownership, but he's too cheap. Like, there are so many good running backs you can play that it really just doesn't feel like you have to eat any chalk there this week.
Yeah, I agree. And I think some of those plays are interesting in the context of the games that will garner more ownership, and thinking about how do you still either play those games with running backs that are leverage on the pass game or vice versa. And so, just big picture wise, right? I think we have essentially 3 games that are going to be a more enticing, better game environment with multiple plays. We have the obvious one, which is Washington, Arizona. That will command the majority of the chalkier stacks. Daniels and Kyler will by far be the most owned quarterbacks. I don't have a huge problem with that. I think it is a very attractive game environment. I will point out that we have had many good game environments so far not get there, and so it's just worth pointing out that it's still football. It could go under, but I would be unsurprised to see that game shoot out. I think most people would be unsurprised to see that game shoot out. And I think we can get into some sort of creative thinking around that game and the next 2 I'll mention in a minute. But the other one that I think is going to was a little sneakier early in the week, but now it's not sneaky at all. It's been bet up from 46 to 47.5. So it's only 1.5 total below Washington, Arizona, is Cincinnati at Carolina. Some very affordable plays in that game. So I think that will make it very attractive. Burrow projects for decent ownership. I think, small sample size, primetime game last week. I think people, even though the Bengals lost to Washington in that big shootout game, I feel like a lot of people felt like Burrow looked a lot better, and there's a general desire to play him by the field. I don't think it'll be sneaky whatsoever, but it's another game to think about. Okay, if that's going to be chalky, and if I'm not playing a Burrow stack or playing the Bengals pass game, a guy like Zach Moss, who will be fairly low owned, I think quite low owned, and projects really well. That's the type of thing you start to be attracted to. And that gets back into the point I've made in prior bakery episodes and in our stream here, which is that, if you're not playing a player from a given game or a passing stack from a given game, like what are you saying is going to happen in that game instead? And so if you're not playing the Bengals pass game, the Bengals have that second highest total on the slate. Are you saying that it's just spread all around, or does that maybe mean that Zach Moss is having a good game, right? I think it's important to keep those kind of indirect sort of narrative build aspects in your head as you're going through it. And then the third game I'll mention is Houston Jacksonville. I think Stroud has been disappointing thus far. A lot of people stacked him last week. We had that sort of weird Tank Dell chalk that props to you and to Paydirt overall for pointing out that we thought that was not great chalk. But I think there's a sense from a lot of people that it's a matter of time before Stroud gets rolling. This could be a get right spot against a pretty weak Jacksonville team. And I think that I wouldn't put it at the level of ownership or game environment as Cincinnati, Carolina, or Washington, Arizona. But you do sometimes see in every DFS sport that sort of third or fourth higher total game go off at a much lower ownership. And I'll point out that Sheets have Stroud stacks in the team stack range of outcomes as like easily the highest ceiling. So it's just worth pointing out at what projects to be meaningful ownership, but I really think will come in at lower ownership than Arizona and Washington stacks. So I just think it's important to keep in mind that those three games, I think, will garner a lot of ownership. I think Carolina, Cincinnati might be a little bit more mini one-off driven because of the value in it, whereas Arizona, Washington might be more stacked heavily by the field because of Kyler and Jaden. But I think it's important to keep in mind, again, what are you saying in those games? If you don't use them, how can you play some alternative players in the game that are doing well if the stack doesn't go off? And then thinking about what pieces of those games are most exciting to you one way or the other. And then the last thing I'll mention, just for really small field, like some of the things I play, is that if you do like a game, and I do particularly like Arizona, Washington, consider how you hyper correlate it. Like, what are ways you can really just go all in? And if it really, really, really shoots out, in a field where you don't have to beat that many people, you don't need to straight nuts, maybe consider going heavier on it. So just macro, big picture wise, I think kind of like those are the games people are going to be focused on. And I think there's some other much sneakier spots for sure. But I think to your point before, I don't really have a problem with those games. I think it's more about how you play those games and what are the secondary pieces you build in to have your leverage.
Yeah, I love Houston stacks, and they're going to be super chalky. But worth noting that almost all of that ownership is coming from Nico Collins, right?
Yeah.
Like Nico Collins is probably going to be 30-something% owned in the 150. Stroud and Diggs. So the top overall QB +2 in the team range of outcomes is CJ Stroud plus Nico Collins plus Stephon Diggs. It projects for about 55 fantasy points, right? With ownership of 42.87%. All right. So Nico Collins has an ownership projection of like 23%, right? Like over half of what that sum ownership is. So Stroud and Diggs coming in at an average of around 10%. That stack by itself isn't really all that chalky, right? Stroud is probably going to be the third, maybe fourth highest owned quarterback on the slate. Stephon Diggs probably not going to be above 20% owned. Maybe he will be, but I don't think he'll be above 20% owned. So when you just automatically, right, when you combine those, you end up with more relative value than is advertised by that ownership. So it's always worth keeping that in mind. And this is a good spot for Houston. And I think that they make a lot of sense from a this is a stack that should start getting going here pretty soon. They're getting used to having digs available for that kind of stuff, and I think that all of that makes sense. The
Yeah, it
Arizona,
definitely feels like a get right spot. There's no doubt about it. And I just want to emphasize one point you made, which is that while the stacks look somewhat owned, it's mostly just Nico. Like CJ Nico dig stacks are going to be nowhere as chalky as Kyler or Jaden Daniels stacks, and I would bet you they're even lower than Burrow Chase stacks.
yeah, I think that that's a fair way to look at it. And I was going to say Arizona, like that ownership is going to be spread. Kyler's going to be 16. Marvin Harrison's probably going to end up 25% owned. Michael Wilson is going to end up like 15 to 20% owned. All those guys are going to carry actual ownership.
Yeah.
And even Elijah Higgins is projecting like for some ownership as well, right?
I think he might be the chalkiest tight end on the slate. I think
that'll be Godert. That'll be Godert.
Fair enough. But I mean, some of the other sites are really, really pumping Higgins as super value, and yeah, I mean, I would say two things about that. That's a good segue into another question I've been asking myself beyond like, okay, how do I play these three games in interesting ways that other people won't? So, if I'm playing a Daniel stack or a Kyler Murray stack, how do I stack them in a way that might be a little more unique than other people? And then how do I get a piece of Cincinnati, Carolina? For example, my favorite way to get a piece of Cincinnati, Carolina, if I'm not playing a Burrow stack, and I want to throw one other thing out there, and this is going to sound really gross, but it is backed up by the sheets stacks 2x and 3x, which is sometimes taking the other side of a game that everybody's playing can be a really unique way to play a game. And it's very, very gross, but it's very, very cheap. And it's why it's amongst the highest 2x, 3x, 4x on the slate, which is you can also play Dalton stacks with like Deontay Johnson and Tommy Tremble. And you can still play, and then you've got so much salary to play Chase opposite it, and then whatever the fuck else you want. But the point I was going to make is that if you are playing a Jaden stack or a Kyler stack or a Stroud stack, I think you can still get a piece of Cincinnati by, instead of doing the thing, which is what everyone else will do, which is play Tremble opposite like Chase, or play Mingo opposite Chase, you can play Zach Moss. And to me, that's like one of my favorite things on the slate, Zach Moss. Just as a way of saying, hey, that game might not get there. It does, but it gets there through Zach Moss and not so much of the pass game. The other thing I was going to ask about from your standpoint, macro build sort of approach, and maybe the easiest way to address this sometimes is to do the sort of NBA thing and just run the optimal. But I've been asking myself about, are people going to jam in like while there's a lot of flexibility at running back across the entire range of pricing, at the very, very high end of flex players, like running back and wide receivers, tight ends, it's actually a pretty small number of players that I think will generate a lot of ownership. Like it's going to be like Breece Hall, Nico Collins, Bijan. I think Saquon will get some ownership, but I don't think he's going to be super high because I don't think people are that excited about that game. In general, the Eagles, I think everybody feels like are really hurt by the injuries they've had. So I think there's just not a huge number of really high end pay ups. It's like Breece Hall, Nico, Bijan, Saquon, Rashee Rice. I don't think Marvin Harrison, even though people love Kyler, is going to be that owned. I think Chase and him are kind of going to be close to each other. And that's kind of like it for like really expensive guys that people are going to pay up for and be chalky. And I've been asking myself, like, are we better off trying to get there on those guys? And then in that de facto, that means using a cheaper quarterback or using one of the really cheaper value pieces, whether it's a tight end and or wide receiver. Or are we better going off like a little more balance and not necessarily forcing in like 2 or 3 of those really high end pieces. And I know that's like it's going to be lineup dependent, but it is something I try to keep in mind when I'm building is like how is my lineup ceiling comparing when I'm using those really expensive guys versus more balanced builds. And to some degree it is affected by how good or bad you think the value pieces are, because those value pieces are usually going to be very fragile, and there's going to be a lot of people playing um, Elijah Higgins and Trey Tucker this week to fit those guys in.
Yeah, in general, I would prefer not to play somebody below 4K, just like on principle. It has to be like an actually it has to be one of two things. It has to be somebody who has produced really, really well and can earn targets on their own in a spot where they are going to be in a position to earn targets. So an example would be like Tutu Atwell, right? Like Tutu Atwell has a career targets per route run of over 2%, which is good, right? Like we want that. It's not elite, but it's good. And so if he ends up being somebody who's like $3,800 and is going to step into a role with no Nakua and no Cooper, then that makes sense, I think. But somebody like Tommy Tremble at 2,700, like people are going to force him in, and this dude has no track record, like at all. And that's really, really weak. Jonathan Mingo is going to get ownership this week. And I'll go look at his stats right now. I have not looked that much at him because I have absolutely no reason to play him. But so far through 3 games, in the first game he had a TPR of 26%. In the second game and third game it was 13 and 14%. 14% on 72% route participation in week 3 after Adam Thielen ended up being out. That's not actually like a good targets per route run. That's not really like a good baseline. And to make it worse, like a lot of his targets have not been catchable. So far in the year, only 58% of his targets have been catchable.
The other hole you can poke into it is also that there's nobody knows, because we've only had 3 games, but there's some belief that they may want to get the rookie Leggett involved too, who's cheap.
Yeah, and Leggett is cheap, and they have basically the same targets per route run. Like they both were better in week 1. Leggett had 26% of the targets in week 1. So like when it comes to guys like that, like a Jonathan Mingo who's going to get ownership, or a Tommy Tremble that's going to get ownership, if those are the values that people are going to be playing, I'm just not going to be playing. I'm not going to be building the same rosters that other people are going to be building, and that's not a bad thing. Trey Tucker is another guy you mentioned. He's 3,600 and looks like he's garnering some ownership. He jumped up to 10% today. He'll probably jump up to 14 to 15% tomorrow, I would guess.
I think he'll be closer to 20.
Yeah, he'll be up there. He'll be up there. And it's like you're attaching kind of a no-name wide receiver to Gardner Minshew on one of the worst teams in the league against the Cleveland defense. Like that.
Yeah,
like
in a game with a low total and the Raiders, who have the 3rd lowest total on the slate, 17-point total.
Yeah, like that's what we want to do here. I don't see it. I just don't see it. He was good last week, 87% of the routes, 23% of the targets, with like solid utilization and like 22.6 PPR points, but I don't have any reason to tie myself to that. Jacoby Myers, on the other hand, has produced in a bad offense and had 26% of the targets, 19 fantasy points last week. And like that is somebody that I would rather attach myself to if I was going to attach myself to any of the Las Vegas wide receivers, because he has shown that at the very least he can do it, you know?
Yeah.
He has a track record. So this is kind of like a long way of saying I really don't want to be attaching myself to like bad players just because they make my roster work. Like I'd rather build around. And while I have been on this little rant, I went and ran cash optimals. I just ran 100 of them. Elijah Higgins shows up in 37% of them.
Yeah.
Which is a lot. So he's probably going to end up. I mean, his projected ownership is 9%. You're right. I think he's going to jump up quite a bit. If he's shown up in 37% of cash optimals, that's the largest deviation from projected ownership. Greg Dortch is another one, but people likely aren't going to push Dortch all that much. So
yeah, and I think what is nice about having such obvious chalk is that pivots become much easier. And so let's just take Elijah Higgins, for example, 3,100. So let's say you like the cheap tight end, and I think we've all been more likely to punt a tight end than in years past so far because we just haven't seen tight end breaking slates.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same exact price, right, opposite your Stroud stack or opposite Collins mini, you have Brenton Strange, who was targeted a bunch last week and who is the 7th best 2x on the sheets, right? At like nothing, it's going to be zero ownership compared to Higgins. Look, I don't think Brenton Strange is good, but if he's going to be 1% and Higgins is going to be 35%, and you can correlate him opposite Collins or Stroud, I don't know that it's that hard of a decision, right?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think Brenton Strange is a great option, especially because we like Houston stacks. We can bring it back to Brenton Strange. Like that's
right. And I thought that's the second thing you were going to say, which I think I do think you believe, but correct me if I'm wrong. Which is, if you are going to consider one of those punts under 3.5 to 4K, at least try to do it in a correlative fashion, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're game stacking Cincinnati, Carolina, and you're playing like an unowned Dalton, okay, like it's not as big a deal then to play a Tremble because you're already getting wild enough with your stack, and you're banking on that game just blowing out, right? And so not blowing out, blowing up. So I think it's a bad way to build. It's like an NBA approach where, yeah, and I understand the thinking. I understand taking the optimal for small field, single entry, and just making a few pivots. Like I don't think it's crazy, but I think you have a lot more win equity often if you are willing to just build a different structure overall, and then as opposed, it's kind of like a bottom up versus a top down strategy in building. Like, are you just saying as you're building, okay, I'm not going to be playing like a one-off Elijah Higgins as chalk because I'm playing a small field, and then by definition you're already playing like a lower owned Brenton Strange or someone like that who's correlated in your lineup, or are you going top down and saying, okay, here's the cash optimal, I'm going to make a few pivots and calling it a day? I'm much more of a bottom up builder. I think both approaches can work fine. I just think you need to be very cognizant if you're more of a top down guy that you're really thinking through why your lineup, game script wise and leverage wise for your size of contest makes sense.
Yeah, I gotta say, I'm looking at these cash game optimals and they kind of fuck. They're kind of good. Here's one of the cash game optimals. All right, Kyler Murray with Jordan Mason and Najee Harris, with Rashee Rice, Nico Collins, Deontay Johnson, Tommy Tremble, Michael Wilson, and San Francisco 49ers defense. That kind of fucks hard. Like that's good.
Yeah. There's a lot of good chalk. There's no doubt about it. There is plenty of good chalk, which makes it harder. I mean, you really need to decide, like, you're pivoting off chalk either because of just ownership / leverage / ceiling, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to. At the end of the day, that's kind of like how you define leverage, right? To a large degree.
But here's the thing. I just listed that off, and like all you would need to do to make this like a kick-ass single entry lineup, like kick-ass small field, is swap from Rashee Rice to Marvin Harrison Jr. to correlate with Kyler Murray, and swap from Deontay Johnson to Rashid Shaheed, who's projected to be 1% owned at the same price and like burned everybody last week, and then have a different defense, and like that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's all you need to do. And you just built like a single entry lineup that is pretty easy. And if you wanted to take a step further, like you could get off of Tommy Tremble or Jordan Mason, right? Like we talked a whole bunch about, you can get off into a different running back, and like that's why I preach all the time that you should start with the optimal, especially when building small field. You should start with the optimal, and I think that it gets really hard to have all of these different tools at your disposal, have contest sims and pivot finders and fucking like projections from 40 different sources and 17 different podcasts, and like people have all this different shit, and they would be better off just building the top 5 optimals and then finding like 3 pivots and just running with it. Like it should only take 4 minutes to build for most people.
Right.
And
or at a minimum comparing your build to like at some point comparing it to the optimal and saying like, okay, am I sacrificing too much here on median in the name of ownership?
Right. Yeah.
Right. And a lot of this comes down to chalk. A lot of this comes down to chalk analysis and how strongly or poorly you feel about it, and like where are you going to be willing to sort of pick your battle on the fade, right? So I wanted to ask you about the chalkier players on this slate, and of course these questions are always relative to the alternatives. It's never like, do I feel good or bad about it in a vacuum? It's always, do I feel good bad about it based on the projection, but also relative to pivots. And so if I sort sheets by ownership at flex, and I'm sort of, we can do the same thing for quarterback, although I think I don't know that either one of us feels that bad about Kyler, Daniels, or Burrow, who I think will be the chalkiest quarterbacks. But let's stay away from quarterbacks for a minute. So at flex, right, we've got Mason, Collins, Rice, Deontay Johnson, Najee Harris, Brian Robinson. Wilson I find surprising. I'm not sure I believe it, but maybe. I think Dortch will come in higher than him. Diggs, Bijan, and then like Hubbard, Connor, Hall, and then it's like everybody else is below 15%. So yeah, I guess, and again, we always talk about this, but I just feel the need to point it out because I don't know, like it's probably the number one thing I see in NFL that I not just repeatedly that I'm not sure the crowd understands, which is that it's total lineup leverage, right? Like it's never one or two guys. It's always like, what is the entirety of your lineup's leverage? And that's why we always talk about, okay, if you're already playing kind of an off the radar stack, then, and you think some of this chalk is fine, it's not, is it good or bad chalk? It's fine chalk, and I'm already weird with my primary stack. So, and for my field size, that's enough leverage to win. But staying with those kind of really owned guys, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on who of those you would find to be the most the easiest fades, either because of role or because of pivot / alternatives.
The number one that I think is easiest to fade is Deontay Johnson. And I wrote him up as a fade in multiple spots. I wrote him up in the newsletter in the breadcrumbs sent out this morning as like the main piece of like leverage fade that I think is easiest to do. I wrote it up over at DraftKings Nation, which was easy, and I wrote it up over at Fantasy Life. He's right there in this price point and projection spot that you can you can find 5 or 6 other wide receivers that are basically either projecting the same or very, very similar and just run with them. So Deontay Johnson at 5,600, he is projected right now for 20% ownership. I think he'll be higher than that. Rashid Shaheed projected, he's 5,500, $100 less, and projects for 14.91, so less than 0.2 less. Terry McLaurin is 5,800, projects for 14.82, so 0.3 less than Deontay Johnson, and is projected for 10% ownership, even though Jaden Daniels is projected to be the chalkiest QB on the slate. Jacoby Myers, after all of the inactives for Las Vegas, 5,500, projects for 14.28, less than a point difference, projected for 2% ownership. That'll go up, but I don't think it'll go up much. George Pickens, 5,700, project for 13.79. You get the point. Like, there are a lot of wide receivers. I was not even talking about running backs or tight ends here, right? Like, if we're considering this for flex usage, like, that I have no reason to play Deontay Johnson, and I can shave 20% some ownership off my lineup just by getting off them. And that's really easy.
I don't disagree. Let me ask you about somebody also in that price range that I've gone back and forth on, only because I think he's going to be probably 30% or so by the time we lock in small field. I think in larger field, it'll probably be closer to 20%, which is Najee Harris. I'm curious on your thoughts on him, because I do think he makes it easy. He's 5,600. It feels secure. I just don't know if that game Pittsburgh is a 21-point total. Indy is a 19-point total. It's a pretty low total game. If it's a slog, I don't know that we care for Najee Harris. I mean, there is some interest, by the field in general and playing Fields, and I don't think it's that far-fetched. It's somewhat of an analogous situation with Fields as it is with most running quarterbacks especially near the goal line, where people have talked about this a lot with Barkley, where it is, if Hurts never rushed for touchdowns, especially out like at the 1 or the 2, like Barkley's projection every game by you and the rest of the industry would be just insane. I mean, it's already a really good projection, but imagine what it would be if Hurts didn't rush every other touchdown in from the 1 or 2. And I do think Fields at some point is going to start running a little bit more. So I guess I'm just wondering, from your standpoint, the fragility or lack thereof in Najee Harris, just because I think he's going to be pretty much in every cash optimal, and I think he'll be very, very, very chalky as a result in small field.
I think he's a pretty bad play. People were making fun of Najee Harris just religiously last year, and just calling for Jaylen Warren to take his job, and saying how much he sucks, and saying how slow he is, and saying how and now everybody wants to play him. And there's one thing to be said about, like, oh, well, what if he has more opportunity because Jaylen Warren is out? So last week, in week 2, Jaylen Warren had 45% of the snaps, 42% of the routes. Those dropped down because of injury, down to 34% of the snaps and 29% of the routes. Najee Harris did not see basically any jump. You could argue that he had a 5% boost in rushing attempts and routes, but Cordarrelle Patterson went from, in week 2, having 7% of the snaps and 8% of the routes to 34% of the snaps and 37% of the routes. Like, they're just gonna use Cordarrelle Patterson in a role that was similar to what Jaylen Warren was doing. They're not going to give Najee Harris that much more work. Najee Harris is still going to be touchdown dependent, and he's going to have some fluky shit happen to break 15 fantasy points. I would argue that Cordarrelle Patterson's probably a better play in a vacuum than Najee Harris is. Because, again, I like to try to... One of the reasons why I struggle with rookies is because I like guys who have done it. And Cordarrelle Patterson is somebody who has done it. And we've seen him do it on low volume, too, right? Like, with the Falcons, he was doing it on, like, 15 touches a game or something. He was basically Alvin Kamara light. So I think that Cordarrelle Patterson is just going to take Jaylen Warren's role, and Najee Harris isn't going to get a boost at all, and he's going to score like 12 fantasy points. Yeah.
And I think it also speaks to kind of one of the initial points we made about running back just being full of pivots this week. And if I had like one big takeaway for everybody, it would be to be willing to be creative and think through pivots at running back. I think there's a lot of options across the whole price range. The other thing I asked myself with all chalk pieces is like what is the opportunity cost if I'm wrong in the fade? So like, what if we're wrong about Najee and he gets, and he has like an 80th or 90th percentile outcome in his range? I don't know. Like, I mean, like, okay, am I gonna like kill myself if Najee Harris scores, like, if he runs like 70 yards and scores 2 touchdowns, like it would hurt. Is it something you couldn't recover from? Like he's not gonna run for 180 and 2. Like, right? It's not like if you're playing Najee Harris, like I don't know. Like I just feel like it's easier for me to fade a chalk player if I feel like the likelihood of a ceiling outcome isn't one I can't recover from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like I was making fun of Jason last week for it, right? Where like if somebody's ceiling, it's the New York Giants wide receiver thing, right? Like if somebody's ceiling is like 5 catches for 75 yards and a touchdown, I will fade that every single goddamn week. Like I don't care if that dude's gonna be 30% owned, I will gladly fade that. Same thing with Najee Harris. Najee Harris's ceiling, his like best case scenario, right, is probably something like he had 18 rush attempts last week and 5 targets. And that's probably his ceiling, right? 18 rush attempts, 5 targets, maybe 6 targets, right? If they're leading the game, maybe 20 rushing attempts. His ceiling is that with a touchdown, which is like 18, 19 fantasy points. Like that's his ceiling. Can I get 18 to 19 fantasy points from another wide receiver? Absolutely. Or another running back? Absolutely. So I don't have any reason to fade that. It's the guys who are in kind of their own stratosphere in terms of either price or projection that I worry about. Najee Harris at 5,600, I can get a very similar position there from either Brian Robinson, Zach Moss, Jerome Ford, Shuba Hubbard. If let's see. I mean, we can just take those guys first, right? Like Zach Moss is somebody that we're super into. I can do it with Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones is right there.
Yeah.
Like all those guys.
Right. As opposed to your point of stratosphere, and that's a really good way of putting it. And I'll just pick Nico Collins, right? Like if you fade Nico and he gets to a ceiling outcome, like you're fucked. You're fucked.
Yep.
Like maybe you played Rashee Rice instead of him because they're 100 apart, and so you might still get there. But that's like almost it. Like it's just slate breaking upside, right? So that's a lot for me. Fading a Nico is a lot harder than fading a Harris. I think that's kind of the point.
Yeah, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning of this, right? Where like I'm much more inclined this week to play really popular stacks and just get different around it, because I think that fading Nico Collins is hard. I think that fading, Rashee Rice is hard. I think that he's in a great spot. I think that fading Marvin Harrison Jr. is hard. I like all of those guys a lot. I think fading Jamar Chase, even at a relatively high price, is hard. So I would much rather have access to these alpha wide receivers on these good teams in good spots than try to pay down and find some weird stuff to make work. Like, do I really want to play Mike Evans over Nico Collins this week? No. Absolutely fucking not. I don't want to do that.
Right.
Do I really want to play Garrett Wilson against Denver instead of Nico Collins? No. Fuck no. I don't want to do that. So these guys, these wide receivers are in such good spots. And it's like every single one of those chalky wide receivers above 6,500, I feel uncomfortable fading. I don't feel that way about running backs. I don't feel that way about tight ends. Wide receivers, it's really hard to get off the wide receiver chalk this week.
I agree. Going to your point on chalky stacks, I just want to talk for a minute about the most common way that the field will probably approach at least Washington, Arizona, and Cincinnati, Carolina, because I think it's important to understand as you're either doing that and then getting different around it, or doing that differently itself, right? So I think for Washington, Arizona, probably at least in smaller field, the more common approach for Kyler stacks, it'll be to play Kyler with, for sure, Marvin Harrison, and then some combination of Elijah Higgins, Dortch, and Wilson. Although I think Higgins by far will command. I think Murray, Harrison, Higgins stacks are going to be way more owned than Murray, Harrison, Dortch, or Murray, Harrison, Wilson, or even Murray, Harrison, skinnies. So I think just like I understand. Like I have less of a problem playing Higgins as part of Murray stack than playing him as a one-off. But I do think you can just play Dortch or Wilson with Harrison instead if you're playing Murray, if you're not going to skinny him. And then opposite that, I think it'll be very common to use Brian Robinson. The hard part is that I think Brian Robinson is a really strong play, and the sheets agree. And his 2x, 3x, 4x for his price range is like pretty strong. So it's kind of one of those situations where I'm saying, okay, if I'm playing a Murray stack, like just how am I playing it differently? I think one way to play it differently is to play Marvin Harrison plus Dortch or Wilson instead of Elijah Higgins. And for smaller field, that's already enough if you're playing Brian Robinson. The other thing you can consider doing is playing McLaurin instead of Robinson. And then opposite that, with Jaden Daniels, I think some people will just play him naked because he does run a lot. And he's been running a lot. I mean, it's not to be taken lightly. I mean, he has major rushing upside. And it's like we're starting to see a quarterback that's like a version of why we used to play Lamar for only 6,500. It's a very attractive play at his price in that game. But I think I do think Terry McLaurin will be underowned, because I think Daniels will be played naked, and I think a lot of people will play Kyler. And when people play Kyler, they're going to be playing Brian Robinson opposite of him instead of Terry McLaurin. So, any thoughts on that? I think those are kind of my high level thoughts on how that game will be mostly played.
Yeah, that's we don't usually run into situations where both the running back and the stack are like heavy chalk. We don't usually run into this. And kind of my bread and butter situation is usually, if a stack is really popular, I'm going to play the running back in a lineup. And if the running back's really popular, I'm going to play a stack in a lineup. But I can't do that this week as easily, or at least as effectively, because what am I going to do? I'm going to play Brian Robinson at 30% instead of a Washington stack at 30%,
Right.
It's a harder situation. But that being said, there's a couple different things. Terry McLaurin only projects like 10% ownership. Washington stacks aren't actually chalky. They're not popular. Jaden Daniels is popular, but people would rather play him naked or play him with I don't know, Zach Ertz, I guess. Like Terry McLaurin only getting 10% ownership. I do think when we flip the cards, it's going to be 15 or 16% owned, but that's still too low with Jaden Daniels being at the ownership that he's at. So if you can stack that and do Jaden Daniels plus Terry McLaurin instead of Brian Robinson, I think that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to use Brian Robinson and bring it back to Marvin Harrison Jr., who is a lower owned piece of the Arizona stack for whatever fucking reason. People are like, Trey McBride's out. Time to play Dortch at 18% owned.
Yeah.
Playing fucking Marvin Harrison Jr.
I think people are just having a hard time with him because of his price. I think because he's 7,500 and you've got Collins and Rice up there. I think Harrison's actually going to be like weirdly low on this slate.
Yeah. That's going to be one of the spots where people are going to look back and they're going to say, why the fuck didn't I just play the easy play? Like, why did I not just play Marvin Harrison Jr. in my Kyler Murray stack and win $1 million doing it? Because people are going to force in guys like Dortch and guys like Michael Wilson. And look, models think that Michael Wilson is a terrific play. Like that, I have no argument against that. But like Marvin Harrison Jr. showed out, crushed in week 2, on like low volume. He only had like 4 catches that game, and he dominated. Right?
Yeah.
He should have way more than that with no Trey McBride available and in this spot. So
yeah.
People are just going to look back and be like, why was Marvin Harrison Jr. only 15% owned? Like he
Yeah.
should have been 40%.
Yeah, the other play I'll just point out because I didn't mention him, and I think because Elijah Higgins will be so popular, this will lower this player is James Conner. I think I would include James Conner as like one of those really strong pivots this week. I don't think he's going to be like super low owned, but by no means will he be heavy chalk.
Mhm.
And he looks like a really strong play. Like just saying, okay, I'm going to play Daniels, McLaurin, Connor opposite is already just that.
Right.
Jaden Daniels, McLaurin, Connor opposite is a very different way to play that game. Just in of itself, right? Similar
Yeah.
to playing Marvin Harrison with Kyler instead of playing Elijah Higgins with him.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I have a thought in my head of a spot that I think is really, really interesting, that I think is going to be really unique, but captures all of the upside. I want to get your thoughts on it because I've been thinking about it all day. I want to.
And then after that, I want to talk about Cincinnati, Carolina.
Okay, yeah. I want to stack Philadelphia, but I want my stack to be Jalen Hurts plus Saquon Barkley, and that's it. I want to do a game stack here, not a game stack, like a game scenario where Philadelphia is able to put up points against Tampa Bay, but all of the production comes from Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley has like 8 targets because there's no AJ Brown and no Devontae Smith and no Britton Covey and everybody is beat up. So they lean on Saquon Barkley to supplement that. And Jalen Hurts has to actually run so that the offense can move. And all of the production just comes from those two guys. And then bring that back with Godwin to lower my volatility a bit because nobody is going to stack Jalen Hurts with Saquon Barkley. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I think for sure it's a slightly larger field play. I think the question you ask yourself in that, so I think I think the logic behind I'm capturing nearly all of the Philadelphia upside is sound in that it's really like Hurts, Barkley, and Goddard. And you're by just playing Hurts and Barkley when Goddard will be the chalky piece of that game, you're already getting leverage off Goddard, and you're playing two pieces that come together will be unowned. I think the counter argument to it is really price, which is just that you are playing Hurts instead of Daniels, Murray, Burrow, or one of the cheaper guys like Fields, or Stroud for that matter, who's 200 cheaper than Hurts, and then you're playing Barkley, who's really really expensive too. So I just think you really need them to like get an astronomical ceiling to make up for the fact that both of them are really a lot more expensive than your quarterback stacks that you would otherwise use.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that it's probably more of something that I'll throw in the millie. I don't think I might play it in the 150, but the way that I would play it in the 150 or in the 333 would be you start with those guys and then you just eat the rest of the chalk everywhere else.
Yeah.
Because you don't need any more relative value after that. If you just go Hurts plus Saquon Barkley and then just go, all right, well, that's enough of my leverage for the day. Here's Jordan Mason plus Deontay Johnson and plus Najee Harris plus Michael, like just build a fucking cash game around it. I think that's a really interesting way, I think, to capture all the upside from Philadelphia. And it's worth saying, if Jason was here, he would agree with me because Tampa Bay is still missing Vita Vea, who is the only way they stop the run. I think that it's a really interesting spot. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to get to it in my 3 lineups because, like we've talked about, we love so many of there's at least 6 other teams that we'd rather stack.
Yeah.
But I think it's a really, really cool spot. And if somebody has more lineups than I do, I think that it's super interesting.
I mean, similarly, you could make the same argument for Mahomes with Rice.
Yeah.
I mean, just like it's the same argument that it's kind of like it's sort of like the pre-49ers injuries opposite take, right? Like the hard part before Kittle and Debo got hurt, and CMC obviously was that like, the Eagles really, the Niners rather, were really hard to figure out because, they could go off, but you can just get the wrong guys. It's sort of the opposite. It's like when you have a really condensed source of production on a team, it makes it a lot easier to just say, if this team scores a lot of points, it's got to come from like these one or two or at most three players, and those are always nice spots, especially when they're low owned, because if it goes off, like you got the right players, and you're not saying fuck, like I picked the wrong two guys out of the 4 or 5 I had to pick from in that game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The sort of the so I've been looking a little bit at the Carolina Cincinnati game too, like everybody has, and I think the most common approach will probably be Burrow, Chase, bringing it back with Deontay. Chuba looks fairly chalky too. I don't know. Like I think Chuba Hubbard's like a weird play. Like I don't hate him. I mean, he's 5,700. I think he's a fine play. Like at ownership, I think he's a weird play. And so I think that's going to be the main way people play that game is just like straight up Burrow, Chase. I think most people will double Burrow, so they'll use maybe Gesicki just to cross off the tight end checklist, and then T Higgins will be unowned, and I just want to point that out. I understand he's done nothing, but T Higgins is a good fucking player, and at 5,900, like he is going to have a game in the next week or two, and people are going to say, "Fuck! Like, why didn't I play T Higgins at 1%?" So I think just including T Higgins by itself, and by the way, the sheets think he's fine at his price. Like, there's for his price range at 5,900 median ceiling, there's obviously fine other plays, but like for receivers, he's right there in the mix with everybody else. For a guy who will be unowned in a game that will be chalky, right? So I just think he's being overlooked. The other way I think you can play this game, and I said this at the beginning, and I think it is gross, but I do think it allows a tremendous amount of value. It captures a lot of value and then gives you a ton of room to pay up at other spots where you can fit in Rashee Rice and Collins or Barkley, or even if you like Bijan, you can just play the opposite side. I mean, you can play. They've gotten the Bengals have gotten fucking torched. I mean, Jane Daniels just lit them the fuck up. I don't think Andy Dalton's like a great player by any means, but if you're gonna fucking play Deontay Johnson or Tommy Tremble or Jonathan Mingo, and you want to play Jamar Chase, like maybe just play Dalton with two of those guys and Jamar Chase instead of Burrow. Because Zach Moss is going to get some play, right? Or play Zach Moss instead of the receivers, right? We've talked about that a little bit more. I'll just point that out, and then the last thing I'll say about this game is that, in general, like if I'm game stacking, and I don't know that there's data to prove this, but I bet you there is, or I bet you it's provable. I'm happy to, if you disagree, that's fine, but because I might be wrong. But I feel like games that really shoot out, outside of like exceptions, you're usually correlating the past games. Like, so if you're really game stacking this game with a Burrow double, it's more likely that you're going to get there with like Deontay and or Mingo or Tremble opposite than you are with Hubbard, or vice versa. If you're playing Dalton and you're expecting this game to blow up, then you're playing him with Deontay and Tremble, and then you're using Chase and or Higgins or Gesicki opposite. I don't feel like it's as common for the running back on the opposite side to be included when the game just goes nuts. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first off, I am having a hard time wanting to stack Carolina Cincinnati. There's just something that's tugging at me here.
Well, it's going to be much more owned is probably what part of the issue. When it was sneaky 2 days ago, it was much more attractive. Now everybody's on it.
Yeah, there's just something I can't. It's one of those intuition things. It's vibe check. Like I talked about this in the newsletter a couple days ago, but like over the thousands of hours that I've had in modeling and building for lineups and shit like that, there's just something that's like, hey, maybe be a little bit wary here. I think that the only way that I would be playing Deontay Johnson is with Andy Dalton. Like, there's zero chance I'm going to play Deontay Johnson without Andy Dalton. I will say that with confidence right now. To speak to people less likely game stacking with running backs, that is correct, but I think that it has come up more often in the recent year or so. Like, there are a lot of smart people that talk about it and say, hey, you can do this and get exposure to the game through the running back. And I think that there are a lot more people that are catching on, but still not enough. So, like, the balanced, nuanced take here is there's still edge in doing it, but the percentage gap is closing. Whereas, maybe 18% of game stacks should do it and only like 13 or 14% are. There's still some edge, but probably not as much as you want there to be.
Yeah. And then the last thing I'll just say about game environments and game stacks is just what we said earlier, just to repeat it, which is I do think Stroud, Collins, Diggs stacks will be substantially less than Kyler, Jaden stacks, and even then Burrow stacks. Because I think most people playing the Houston game are just going to be playing Collins as a one-off, or that's basically it. I think people are just going to play Collins as a one-off. So I do think, like, if you want to play like a high upside game, I don't think he's going to be unknown. Like, I don't think Stroud's going to be 3%, but I think he's going to be substantially less than Kyler and Jaden, and probably less than Burrow, and for sure the combo of Stroud, Nico, Diggs, which, again, to my prior point on your Hurts idea, is at least partially pricing driven, because you've got Stroud that's significantly pricier than Kyler and Jaden, and then you add in a 7,200 Collins and a 6,600 Diggs, and you are forcing some more value than you otherwise would be with those Kyler, Jaden teams. So, but because of that, it's going to be a lot less owned. And I think if Stroud gets that ceiling game we've been waiting for, at a fraction of the ownership as a stack, you're going to be pretty happy.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through which side of this Arizona-Washington game, and I just keep coming back to Jane Daniels. I don't like the Arizona side near as much. I just like Marvin Harrison Jr. So usually what that means to me is that I just need to stack the other side and use him as a bring back. I ran into this issue a lot with Tyreek Hill last year. I never actually wanted to stack Miami, but I had a lot of interest in Tyreek Hill. So what I ended up doing was stacking the other side and then just using Tyreek Hill and getting my leverage that way. And I think that's the same thing here, where, like, I'd rather have Jaden Daniels plus Terry McLaurin and bring it back with Marvin Harrison Jr. than I would rather have Kyler Murray with Marvin Harrison Jr. and bring it back with a wide receiver from Washington. So I think that's probably where I end up. I am also trying to think through a little bit of how I want to separate out my running backs a little bit. And this is something I'll figure out tomorrow, but I'm just kind of going through some thought process here of, like, usually I try to be really intentional with the way that I use my running backs. And this week I'm feeling that is much more difficult to do. It almost feels like I'd rather just shotgun running backs and just figure it out, like, through exposure. But when I build these things out and I try to think through that stuff, I'm just not finding a way outside of indirect leverage to really build in leverage. Like, this week, there's not that much direct leverage that I'm interested in, and it's almost all just like pivots and price point differences.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the things that I've been enjoying about this week, because I think there's going to be a lot of lineups that are, like, to your point on the cash game optimal being strong, I think it's going to lead to a lot of builds that are basically just like a main stack with a bring back, and then at most like a mini, and then just the cash lineup. And I think if you can play like a full blown correlated lineup, either through a game stack or through like everything is mini opposite around the games around your main stack, just by itself, like that will make your lineup different. Um, and that's maybe just like the way I like to build, and maybe I'm just convincing myself that it's like the right way to do it this week. But I don't know. I just feel like in a week where there's like a few main stacks we like, and then chalk with some good pivots at running back, and then just some like really strong upside receivers, that the way to maybe beat the field is just to make sure it always goes back to that thing of it's just needing to get less things right. And so just being a little more correlated than you normally would.
Yep. Sick. Okay. Sounds like we are gonna win $1 million. So you got any closing thoughts here for the people?
Yeah, I mean, I just think my main closing thought is just be willing to, the last few weeks, my main mistake has been to, especially early season, I have been asking myself, like, where is the edge in NFL for a couple of years now? And I think in early season, especially, we should take advantage of the small sample and the overconfidence that comes from conclusions being drawn from that small sample, whether it's like one or two really good games that somebody's had, a primetime game where people overreact to the primetime game. This week we've got Burrow getting steamed because of what happened, and we've got Deontay Johnson opposite getting steamed because of how he did. And just be willing to like admit to yourself that the foundation of the conclusions that are being drawn is maybe shakier, and sometimes a lot shakier than the field is willing to admit, and trusting yourself and your intuition that fading those spots, it ultimately, whether it happens this week or in a different week, will pay off, because getting different is how you win. It's not by doing the same thing. And so I would just encourage everybody to just be constantly asking yourself, like, where am I getting different, and how much do I win when I win by getting different? And so that's really just my concluding thoughts. Aside from if we have time or if people have questions, just making sure we allow people to ask some questions.
Yeah. I'll give my final thoughts, and we'll take some questions if we got them. My closing thought this week is going to be, I think that it's really, really important to look at the players that you are like keying in on and have a really good understanding of why you're keying in on them. Like, if you're going to play somebody like Jonathan Mingo, I'm not going to fight you on it if you have a good reason to play Jonathan Mingo. Like, if you dug in and you found some sort of thing or nugget that says that Jonathan Mingo is a good play, and you're happy to eat the 10% ownership on him when he has shown nothing to prove that he can do it, that's totally fine. Go ahead and play the person you want to play. Just make sure that like you have an actual reason to do it. Don't just be playing somebody just because. And that's something that I think a lot of people make mistakes with, where they will just like, it's the last man in syndrome, where they'll play somebody just because they fit. And it's like, that's about the worst way that you could possibly build a lineup. So just remember that you are playing a game where your goal is to beat the field. And in order to beat the field, you have to have reasons for the choices that you're making. Beating the field hardly ever comes down to getting lucky. Most people who beat the field are able to do it because they have intention behind the things they're doing. So that is going to be my final thought. Do we have questions from the people? You can take any for 5-10 minutes or so. Going once.
And by the way, the questions don't need to be like big picture game theory. I mean, obviously we're focused on higher level game theory kind of debates, and not as much on like what are the plays. But if people do have more like micro what are the play type questions, that's fine too, I think.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't mind answering just like 1v1s and shit like that. I don't care. And if we have none, then that's okay too. You guys can hate us. It doesn't matter to me.
We'll be in NFL Main too, so people will be talking in Discord.
Yeah, for sure. Going once. Going twice. going thrice. Okay, cool. So we're going to cut it here. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. Looking through kind of like the high level stuff. I'm going to get this uploaded over onto the YouTubes and then put it up on the site. It'll be up as a post for Theory Crafting here in about probably half an hour or so. And then I need to write the Thoughts and Notes article because I was fighting with the fucking models for 45 minutes instead of working. So I'll be doing that. I'll be working tonight. Happy to answer any questions Jug got. But yeah, let's make a good week out of it.
Cool.
All right. Adios.